The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm just going to do a quick sound test. If there are any issues, indicate so in the chat box on the right-hand side of your toolbar. Okay, and we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. This will provide a current manufacturing industry economic update. Today's program will be presented by Dr. Chad Moutray, Chief Economist at the National Association of Manufacturers. Materials for today's presentation can be found in the toolbar located on the right of your screen. Also, at the bottom of the toolbar, you will see a chat box. Please send us questions during the presentation, and we will be sure to address them at the end during our Q&A session. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Hannon, Practice Leader of Witham's Manufacturing, Distribution, and Logistics Services Group.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody. And for those of you on the West Coast, good morning. Again, my name is Jim Hannon, the firm's practice leader of Witham Smith & Brown's Manufacturing Service Group. We're honored to partner with the National Association of Manufacturers. I'd like to thank their president and CEO, Jay Timmons, Joey Ford from our membership group here at NAM. And as mentioned, Chad Moutray, who will be leading our discussion today and walking us through the ever-changing and complex world of manufacturing in a global economy. So thank you, Chad, for that. In closing, I would implore any of you that are putting together your holiday shopping list to consider railroad parts, equipment, heavy equipment, industrial, agricultural, vehicles to kind of kickstart the softness that we're currently looking at right now, but in the spirit of getting those goods out to everybody and making sure that this economic recovery and resurgence of the manufacturing group is long-term rather than just short-term. So Chad, I'm going to turn that over to you, and Santa's sled will be full of heavy equipment to deliver to all the good boys and girls out there this December. Go ahead, Chad. Thank you.
Well, that was a nice segue. So thank you. So I'm going to walk through what I'm seeing in the overall U.S. and manufacturing economy. I'm going to try to be as nuanced as possible. So I promise not to depress you too much, and hopefully you'll sense that naturally I'm a glass half full guy. So you'll see a little bit of that in there as well. For those of you who are interested, you can always reach out to me. I do a Monday economic report each week, and obviously that's available for all NAM members, but you can also see it on my Twitter, which is at the bottom left-hand side of the screen here, so at Chad Moutray. So I'm gonna start just by going through just move the screen here. Hopefully it moves. Just a second, I'm trying to hit the page down and it's not moving. Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to walk through what I'm seeing in terms of what our members are telling us. And I think this first slide will show you a little bit about the NAM Manufacturers Outlook Survey. We've been doing this survey since 1997, and as you see here, we've seen overall optimism kind of decelerate pretty dramatically certainly over the last 6 months. I'm going to bounce back to this time last year. We had 95.1% of our members who were positive in June of 2018. So that was actually an all-time high in the survey's history. Note that members have to actually pick a bucket. They're either positive or negative, and that's what gives us such large numbers here. And the historic average over the 21-year history of the survey is around 75. So anytime you're over 75, you're above average. Anytime you're below that, you are not. And you can see that right now in the September survey, we have roughly 68% of our members who are positive about their own company's outlook. So I guess the good news is that's over 50, right? The bad news is it's fallen pretty dramatically over the last 6 months. We actually had optimism stay relatively elevated as recently as March, and that fell from about 90% to roughly 80% between March and June, and then as I noted, roughly 68 now. This survey is actually going back out in the field at the end of next week. So we'll have a new number in December. So hopefully we'll see maybe some stabilization there, or we'll see where that number goes moving forward. This actually is pretty consistent with where you'll see in a lot of the other data points where so far year to date, especially since earlier in the year, we've seen a deceleration in activity kind of across the board, largely due to what I'll simply describe as the slowing global economy, right? So you'll see a number of slides on that, but also on the trade uncertainties, and I'm sure we'll talk quite a bit about the overall trade policy. Like a lot of surveys along those lines, we ask, what are your expected sales, production, exports, et cetera? And you can see here that these numbers have actually also pulled back quite a bit. Again, last June 2018, these numbers were close to an all-time high in many cases. And we've seen that fall back pretty dramatically, especially over the last 6 months. But notice that all of these numbers in terms of expected growth rates are positive. Even the export number in the September survey was 0.2%, so it's essentially stagnant, but it is still positive. Now we'll see if that changes moving forward, but we were still seeing positive growth and very modest growth overall, 2.1% for sales, but still a positive figure. The number one issue for our members right now is attracting and retaining a quality workforce. That's been the number one issue for 8 straight quarters. Notice that respondents can respond to any one of these questions, so it doesn't necessarily add up to 100. You can pick as many of these that apply. And roughly 70% are saying that they're having trouble finding talent. Even as we've seen a lot of other weakness out there, the labor market continues to be tight. And I don't see this issue going away anytime soon. I do a lot of traveling, and next week I'm in the Dallas and Houston area meeting with some of our member companies, and I'm sure I will continue to hear about workforce there as well. And so that's certainly up there towards the top of the list. Much like trade, I think when I talk to a lot of our manufacturers, they often will, when they look at this slide, say, why isn't trade number one? And then for some companies it is number one. But it's certainly towards the top of the list. Some of the other things of note here, we also see the dollar is about 26% of our members saying that's a top issue. The reality is, and as you'll see this, we hear about the dollar almost in every earnings call, et cetera. So I'm always a little shocked that number is not a little higher on the list. The other comment I would make is that the unfavorable business climate, the taxes and regulations, that was for much of, I've been at the NAM almost 9 years. For much of that time frame, that was the number one issue or number two issue. That has fallen down the list, obviously, pretty dramatically since tax reform. I actually anticipate that as we move into 2020 and get further into the election conversation, that number might start rising up the list ordinarily, but for right now, it continues to be towards the bottom of the list in terms of concerns. So that's the NAM survey. What are we seeing in terms of some of the other data points that are out there? So I'm going to move first to the ISM, the Institute for Supply Management's Purchasing Managers Index. This is probably one of the more widely known data points that are out there. It comes out the first day of the month. So we just did get data for October on November 1st. And I think the bottom line here is that we've seen, and just a little refresher for those of you who are not used to looking at it, numbers under 50 are contracting, any number above 50 is expansion. And we've seen now 3 straight months in a row where this PMI measure is below 50. And so that really would suggest, at least to a lot of folks, that the manufacturing sector is contracting. And it really has been pulled a lot lower, primarily by this export number. So you see kind of that gray number. While it did rebound in October, that September figure was the worst in 10 years. And so it shows you the extent to which that global economy has really pulled things lower. And that's really true relative to where it was last year. So if you flash over to the left side of the screen, you can see that overall new orders, production, employment, all those numbers were growing pretty strongly, certainly in the middle of last year and moving into December and January. It's really been more recently that you've seen that number decelerate pretty dramatically. And that takes us into overall manufacturing production data. We're going to be getting new manufacturing production data for October. We're going to be getting that in next week, actually on November 15th. And you see here that the underlying story for manufacturing production is not a pretty one, right? So you look here, manufacturing production actually has declined in 6 of the 9 months so far this year. Look for it to also contract in the month of October. October really is going to be, and you saw this in the employment data that came out a week or so ago. We had, as you know, we had a strike at General Motors that had huge impacts, not just for the company, but for the supply chain. And that led to some pretty large hiring changes, negative hiring changes, but that I'll show you in a second. It'll also obviously impact manufacturing production. And you see that here in the September data. It will also probably carry through into the October data. Even outside of that, we have in general been seeing weaker data on manufacturing production overall. And you see that on a year-over-year basis, manufacturing production actually has fallen. In September, it was down 0.9% year-over-year. Again, hopefully we see some signs of some stabilization moving forward. At least up to this point, those weaknesses have been pretty pervasive. If there's any positive story there, it is that the December figure, and this is the reason why I like to show you this particular chart, is we've pulled back, but we've also pulled back from a relatively strong position. Manufacturing production in December was, I think, a 4-year high, and so we have pulled back from that number, but at least we're moving from a strong base. And more recently, actually, we have actually more or less just kind of moved sideways, and you were starting to see perhaps some signs that that number had stabilized pre the September figure. Hopefully at some point, certainly after we get past the strike conversation, I think we'll continue to see some signs of stabilization. Obviously, the GM strike has been settled, and so that should obviously bode well moving forward. One other kind of point here, just to mention, this comes from the shipments data, the new orders and shipments data for factory orders, and I'm going to show you this chart. We economists make everything complicated, and so this one is actually non-defense capital goods excluding aircraft, is what it's officially called. We call that core capital goods in economics speak. In layman's terms, this is capital spending. And that's the reason why I like to show you this chart. And this shows you a little bit more of what I was mentioning earlier. Yes, we've pulled back on capital spending, and you see that pretty clearly on the right-hand side of this chart, that on a year-over-year basis, both new orders and shipments for capital goods are down. But we also are building off of a pretty strong base there, and you've seen this rapid run-up in capital spending really since the middle of 2016. And so that's obviously, again, a little bit of nuance there. Yes, we're seeing some weakness now, but in general, it's stronger than it was, say, 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, which is nice. So now moving over to the international picture, since I've mentioned the overall global economy several times, this particular chart that I'm showing you now, I mentioned that I do a Monday economic report each week. I also do a global manufacturing economic update. That comes out the second Thursday of every month. So the next one comes out next Thursday. And this is often the dashboard that I'm looking at when I'm writing it. This is the top 12 markets for exports that we sell into. So you all know that Canada and Mexico are our top 2 trading partners. This is the rest of the list in order. So Singapore obviously is number 12 in this ranking. And this works pretty much like the ISM numbers earlier, right? If the number is over 50, that PMI number is over 50, that means that the manufacturing sector in that country is growing. If it's under 50, it's red and it's shrinking. And of these 12 markets, there are currently 6 expanding and 6 contracting. Put that in perspective, in the September data, we had 7 that were contracting. So you have a little bit of progress here. The progress was really made in Mexico. Mexico shifted into positive territory really for the first time since April. But there really are a couple storylines here, I think, to mention. Number one, it was just a few months ago that I think the top 7 markets were all contracting. So that would have included Canada, Mexico, and China. Today, you really just have those bottom of the 7, right? So Japan, UK, Germany, and South Korea. So you've seen a little bit better data coming out of North America with Canada and Mexico. The Chinese number is interesting. You almost have to put a little bit of an asterisk after that. This number is coming from IHS. The actual official numbers still are showing a contraction. So the Chinese government prepares their own manufacturing PMI, and it still is contracting a little bit. So, and in general, we continue to see slowing growth in China. I actually expect the Chinese market to grow less than 6% year over year moving into 2020. Yet these PMI numbers, for whatever reason, over the last couple months have been rising. So that's showing some rising sentiment somewhere, but overall that trend is continuing to be one that is slowing. The other comments to make here are about the 2 numbers that are the weakest, right? Number 1 is Germany. So Germany, that 42.1 is actually better than it was a couple months ago, but still they've contracted every single month this year, and they're not far from really a 10-year low in terms of that overall PMI number. Germany exports about 20% of their production, and they have really been hurt hard by the slowing global economy, and especially the slowness coming out of China. And so that really has affected not just Germany, but all of Europe, to be honest. Overall, Europe is probably only going to grow around 1% this year and next year, and that's at least half of what it was last year. So that weakness has been pretty pervasive throughout Europe. Obviously, the UK is contracting here as well, but that's all about Brexit. That's entirely the reason why that's happening. The other weak number over there, the weakest of all, is coming from Hong Kong. Hong Kong's 39.3. That's the lowest number since November 2008. I know that because I was just writing the global report, and so that's the number that came out of it. And obviously, Hong Kong, that's all about the protests that are going on right now in China, and in Hong Kong. So that's again, so there's quite a bit of weakness there. The good news here is that you have seen, as I noted earlier, some stabilization on the global manufacturing PMI number at the bottom of the screen. It's just shy of being neutral, and so you have seen that number move a little bit higher in the last couple months. So that's obviously encouraging. And the U.S. PMI number, this is a competitor to the ISM figure that I showed you earlier, has actually shown some stabilization in the last couple months. So I focus so much on this chart because this is who buys our products, right? We want to see as much blue up here as possible, and we want to see our overall exports grow as much as we can. Unfortunately, we've actually seen manufactured goods exports fall so far this year. Through the first 3 quarters of this year, this chart's actually only showing you through the second quarter because we don't have seasonally adjusted data through the third quarter yet, but so far through the third quarter, we've seen 2.9% declines in manufactured goods exports. So that really is pulling back from what we had seen, both positive numbers in both 2017 and 2018. So that's a large part of why we're seeing so much weakness in the U.S. manufacturing sector, is that demand globally has pulled back a little bit. The other comment to make is about the dollar. So I mentioned earlier that I've long been surprised that the dollar is not higher on the list of concerns. Because you certainly hear about the dollar in almost every earnings call, certainly I'm sure with them. You hear this a lot when you're talking to clients. And you see that the dollar has risen about 8.3% over the last year and a half or so. But I guess the other kind of more encouraging story here is that the dollar actually has fallen more recently. So since the end of September, we've seen the dollar fall about 1.7%. And that decline really has everything to do with the fact that we've seen the yield curve start to flatten a little bit and actually start to steepen. And you've seen overall some stabilization in the global economy and hopefully some signs that the risk of a recession has pulled back a little bit. And that the dollar really was rising a little bit over the last few months, largely because the dollar is a safe haven and people were really flocking to it. The other thing that obviously is attractive for a lot of foreigners as they're looking at investing in the dollar is the fact that we still have higher interest rates than the rest of the world. And so that is going to keep the dollar high, but you have seen a little bit of a pullback more recently, which I thought was notable. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to employment. I've mentioned employment several times, and employment really is a mixed bag, right? So you have, on the one hand, you've seen really dramatic slowing in terms of overall hiring, and yet the overall labor market remains solid, and job openings in the sector have remained pretty elevated. And as I noted earlier, manufacturers continue to complain about not having enough talent. So again, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So let's kind of walk through all of those kind of points. The first point to make is that we had a decline of 36,000 workers in manufacturing in the month of October. That was all about the GM strike and its ramifications. Motor vehicle employment was down around 41,000 for the month, and so outside of motor vehicles, you would have seen a slight increase. That doesn't mean that manufacturing has been hiring is growing gangbusters outside of motor vehicles, but at least that explains that large negative number there. Overall, so far, you see that really since January, manufacturing employment has been super soft. And in fact, when you include that 36,000 number in there, year to date, we've actually only added 2,000 workers. So that certainly shows you that hiring has slowed pretty dramatically as we've seen a pullback in demand and production and the overall outlook. That contrasts really with last year. When you look at the numbers for 2018, we actually were averaging 22,000 workers a month last year, and that was the strongest pace since 1997. So we've really seen that overall hiring numbers in manufacturing pull back a little bit from really gangbuster numbers last year. And so as a result, you get this picture here. I do expect that we will get a bit of a rebound in the month of November, largely because the auto strike is over. And I would expect that number to kind of come back and bounce back. 2 months ago, in the month of August, we actually had the highest level of manufacturing employment since December 2008. So we pulled back a little bit in the last couple months, but in general, employment numbers have for the most part held up. And the unemployment rate currently is 3.6%. 3.5, which is where we were in September, was the lowest since December 1969. So we're still hovering around 50-year lows in terms of the unemployment rate. I actually think we're going to get back down to 3.5, probably even to 3.4, and then we'll start working our way back up again. My forecast for the unemployment rate would be closer to 4 by the end of 2020. So we're still going to be, over the next year or so, kind of that historic range of really low unemployment. And that's the reason why that issue of workforce isn't going to go away anytime soon. This is a number, this chart that I'm showing you now came out a couple days ago. This is the job openings and labor turnover survey data. And really, there's two basic storylines here of note. The first is the red line at the top, which is the overall job openings. Job openings have been really elevated this year. They've averaged around 485,000 so far year to date. In the month of June, we actually had an all-time high of 513,000. So we've been, again, job openings have been on fire. They pulled back a little bit, not shockingly, from where they were, but still remain pretty elevated. The other thing to note here is the hires and separations that are at the bottom of this screen. You've clearly seen those numbers pull back a little bit. And more recently, in the month of September, they obviously flipped. So you actually had more separations than hires. So that, again, hopefully will reverse itself moving into October and November, but that certainly is something that I thought was notable. The other kind of bigger storyline that's out there, and this is one that you hear about in the media all the time, is that we continue to have more job openings in the U.S. than people who are actually actively looking for work. So this is the total unemployed is the red line here, the blue line is job openings, and that gap is around 1.2 million between those two figures. So that's, again, a large part of why so many people are complaining about where they're going to find workers. So we started off this conversation talking about holiday sales. The retailers are all worried about where they're going to find people to work in their shops. When I travel around the country, I hear about the lack of construction workers, which in my view are holding back overall housing activity. And you also hear about the lack of truck drivers. And so this is an issue that's not limited to manufacturing. It's one that we hear pretty much everywhere I go. And as a result of that, you have seen some upward movement in overall wages. I think the bigger shock here is, number one, why did it take so long, given that we're at 50-year lows for the unemployment rate? And I guess the other bigger issue is why aren't we seeing bigger increases? In the most recent jobs data, we had a year-over-year growth rate of around 2.9% for average hourly wages or earnings for production and non-supervisory workers in manufacturing. That's down from 3.4 a couple months ago, but still it's a pretty decent figure overall. Again, when you talk about specific occupations, you might see better numbers, but that's essentially where we are. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of the overall economic outlook? So we grew 1.9% in the third quarter. I still have us growing around 2% in both of this quarter, the fourth quarter, as well as the first quarter of next year. I know I've seen numbers out there from other economists and other kind of real numbers from the Atlanta Fed and New York Fed, which are lower than that, but I still am clinging to my 2. I think we're going to get around 2% this quarter. And for the year overall, 2.3% this year, down from 2.9 last year, and I see us growing at 1.8 next year. Notice I do not have a negative number for next year, so I do not have, at least in my baseline forecast, a recession for next year. That doesn't mean that there won't be one. It just means that's not what I would consider to be my baseline forecast. Certainly, I think the bigger risks that are out there right now are coming more from abroad than from the U.S. I mentioned the German situation. Germany obviously is in an industrial recession, and you're seeing a lot of other weaknesses as well. So I think the bigger red flags that are out there for us are coming more from abroad. And so we're going to continue to see some slowing growth, but I don't see us necessarily falling into a recession. I see the risk of a recession right now probably around 30%. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit though and talk a little bit about why we're getting such slower growth today than say we did in the first quarter when we had 3.1. And to do that, I'm going to remind you, I'm sure you all took economics and you loved economics. And so when you did, you probably remember the formula that GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C, of course, is consumer spending. It's 70% of GDP. I is business investment. G is government spending. And X minus M is exports minus imports, or net exports. You see here that when you're looking at this particular chart, this is showing you where that 1.9% growth rate came from in the third quarter. You see that it almost entirely came from the consumer. Consumer spending on durables and non-durables, as well as the service sector, really accounted for more than 2% of growth in the third quarter. You also saw positive contributions coming from the federal government, from housing, which that was the first time really in a little bit more than a year we'd seen a positive contribution coming from the housing market, and from state and local. The drags were coming primarily from business spending. You see the huge decline there from non-residential fixed investment, as well as a little slight declines coming from both net exports and inventories. It's notable here that business spending has been a drag on GDP for 2 straight quarters. That was really those are the first negative numbers in GDP from business spending in 3 years. And again, that really speaks to just how uncertain right now the manufacturing sector is with regard to the global economy and certainly that trade picture. And that's really what's pulling that overall forecast down a little bit, in my view. When you look at manufacturing production for this year and next, I see it's essentially being relatively stagnant this year. I have 0.3 up here as kind of the forecast for the annual average for manufacturing production this year, and maybe a little bit better than that next year. All of those numbers obviously are well below what they were in 2018, which was 2.7% growth. So still, I see some better numbers ahead, but certainly nothing really to brag about. So I'm going to go through a few charts here quickly so we can get to your questions. So first off, we'll do consumer spending. The consumer, as we noted earlier, continues to be mostly positive, but they also pay attention to the news, right? They see stories about the yield curve in August. They talk about the recession. They see what's happened in a lot of other things in terms of the news. And you've seen quite a bit of volatility in these data points over the course of the last year or so. And so as a result, in general, while they still remain overall positive, but you've seen a little bit of a pullback in optimism in many cases. And so the result of that is that you actually have a very cautious consumer overall. When you look at the month-to-month spending here, you see that in September, retail sales actually pulled back a little bit. I actually expect that to rebound as we move into October and November a little bit. But while even though the consumer has been a bright spot, you do get a sense that there is a bit more of caution there, perhaps more than we would prefer. The bottom line, though, is even with that caution, we're still seeing modest gains overall for retail sales, and that's obviously an encouraging sign, and as I noted earlier, something that's helping to keep the U.S. economy afloat. In terms of housing, we did have a little bit of a pullback in the month of September in terms of overall housing starts, but that came primarily from multifamily, which is very volatile from month to month. The numbers for single family starts have actually been encouraging, and that's a sign, really, at least to me, that the homeowner is reacting pretty favorably to lower mortgage rates. And you see that also when you look at overall builder confidence, which has been pretty stable, pretty strong actually, and overall building permits, which are pretty strong. So that's a sign to me that the housing market is going to continue to be a positive that's out there. We have seen mortgage rates pull back up a little bit from where they were a couple months ago, but they're still well below where they were at this time last year. If you remember this time last year, in November of 2018, they were hovering just shy of 5% for a 30-year mortgage. That fell to about 3.5%. It's currently around 3.7, 3.8%. But still, that's a nice positive number, and you've seen the housing markets react to that in a very strong way. On a more discouraging note, manufacturing construction has really been flat over the last couple of years. You see quite a bit of volatility here from month to month, but there has really been, surprisingly so, not growing as fast as we would like. It is up slightly on a year-over-year basis more recently, but given tax reform and given some of the other things that are out there, you might have expected some stronger data points here, and we might see that moving forward, but it has not moved as fast as we might like. So I'm going to end off here by talking a little bit about the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and talk a little bit about prices. So this first chart is showing you the preferred measure from the Federal Reserve. This is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Deflator, which is a fancy way of saying personal spending. So this is the prices that you pay for spending. And the goal here for the Fed is to have core inflation at 2%. And as you can see here, while you've seen that deflator tick up a little bit, it's actually remained below 2%. And that is actually a worry for the Fed, that we're seeing pricing below its goal of 2, at least to the Fed, suggests that the lack of inflation might suggest some weakness in the economy. And that's a large part of why almost every time you hear Bernanke speak, he talks about inflation that is below its target, and how that really affects the stimulative moves that it's made more recently. Now, with that said, I will also note that there are other measures of inflation out there. The producer price index looks very similar, I guess, in terms of that decelerating trend we've seen over the last year. It also is showing quite a bit of deceleration in pricing pressures since what we had in September of last year. Pricing pressures, if you remember, in the middle of 2018 were actually one of the top concerns. Some of that was tariff related, but we've seen that pull back from where it was, and it's not quite the concern that it was 1 year ago. On the other hand, consumer prices actually have picked up a little bit. And so when you strip out food and energy, you've actually seen consumer inflation being one of the more stronger elements here. Still nothing to pull your hair out over, but definitely a little bit stronger inflation on the consumer side than you're seeing on the producer side in terms of challenges. So what that essentially has meant, and I hinted about this earlier, is that the Fed, I'm going to come back to that chart. The Fed has actually reduced rates now three straight meetings, both at its July meeting, its September meeting, and then more recently at its October meeting, really in an effort to try to stimulate growth, to keep the recovery moving as much as it can, really backing off of what it really had been doing since 2016, which was trying to normalize rates. So you've seen the overall federal funds rate kind of pull back a little bit. I actually expect the Fed will hit the pause button at this point, and I don't see any further rate cuts for at least for the next year. And I don't see any rate increases until at least 2021. So barring any further weakening in the economy, I think the Fed is going to hit the pause button for the foreseeable future. I know that there are people out there, including the president, who would like stronger declines in interest rates, but that's probably not going to happen. The Fed is, however, I'll go back to this other chart, it has gone pretty aggressively in the last month or two to try to shore up the short-term T-bill market. And you've seen the Fed's balance sheet actually start to tick up again, and it's actually approaching $4 trillion again. That should provide, through the back door, a little bit of additional stimulus to the economy as well. And so both of those moves really are designed to hopefully provide some additional stimulus to overall economic growth. The changes that you've seen really have started to push up the 10-year Treasury notes, and you see that in terms of this chart here. But it also has started to, as I noted, steepen the yield curve. If you remember, in August, everyone was worried about us going into a recession. The yield curve inverted for the first time in 10 years, and that really caused quite a bit of panic. Since then, the yield curve has actually steepened a little bit, and those recessionary worries have actually pulled back a little bit, which is a nice, encouraging sign. So with that, I've done quite a bit of talking here. I'm sure we have some questions. Here's my contact information. Once again, my Twitter is on there. But what questions do you have for me?
Thank you, Chad. I'll read the questions that came in during the presentation, and if you still have questions and have not submitted them, please take the time right now to do so. One question is, do you see any type of stimulus plan being developed over the next 6 to 9 months?
So by stimulus, I'm assuming you're talking about fiscal stimulus. I mean, obviously the National Association of Manufacturers has long supported some type of an infrastructure plan, and that would have obviously provided a huge stimulus, something that both business and labor and both Republicans and Democrats agree on. The challenge there is finding a funding mechanism that works for both sides, right, given the funding challenges that are there. I don't know how possible that is, given the conversation about impeachment, and the window is obviously pretty narrow there for that conversation, but it's certainly something that we have supported. I don't see any other stimulus out there. Certainly, there has been talk about tax reform 2.0 and that kind of stuff. That's probably not likely. I think that conversation probably is more saved for a second Trump term, if there is one. So I don't really see any other stimulative moves in the works, at least from a fiscal standpoint, which leaves all of the stimulus really coming more from the monetary side. And as I noted, the Fed has cut rates 3 times in its last 3 meetings, and you're going to see some additional moves in terms of what they're doing to shore up the short-term market. And other central banks also have been very aggressive in terms of monetary policy. So I think most of the stimulus you're going to see is coming more from the monetary side and not from the fiscal side.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, can you comment on the recent news today on perceived progress on China trade talks and any specific issues that may be roadblock to the deal?
Sure. I guess I'm going to add one comment before I get to China and say that there is a stimulus that's out there, and that is that the federal government, the overall fiscal deficit this year is going to be $1 trillion. So it's once again, so that means obviously we're spending like crazy, and so that obviously provides some stimulus in and of itself. So I shouldn't negate that. In terms of the China conversation, I think it's encouraging that the U.S. and China continue to talk. We obviously have been trying for a long time at the NAM to try to push for a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and China. There's been some long-standing issues there that are important for our members. For a long time, they've been stealing intellectual property and obviously have forced transfer and all that kind of stuff. Access has been an issue in terms of some of our members to that marketplace. And so, we obviously hope that those things are part of any larger deal. But I think the bigger point here is that the new tariffs are not going to be going into effect. And I think the conversation today is that not only is there a truce, but there is some conversation about kind of in a phased way scaling back tariffs on both sides of that, both from the U.S. and Chinese perspective. Those are obviously encouraging. I think we still don't know a lot about it. I think the information about that more phased tariff reduction comes from the Chinese side, and so we haven't really seen confirmation there. And as is often the case, there's a lot of speculation and not always a lot of hard news. And so we do take it as a positive sign. I'm encouraged that they are still talking, but I think it's still early to say how positive that is.
Thank you. Are there any sectors within manufacturing that seem to be weathering the storm better than the standard manufacturer?
My sense is that manufacturing is down pretty much across the board. When you look at the production numbers on a year-over-year basis, and you look at the 19 major sectors, there's weaknesses really in almost every one of those sectors. And I think that really just speaks really to just how pervasive the slowdown has been. It's not limited to just motor vehicles or aerospace or anything else. I do think that when you're looking on the employment side, you've seen a little bit better data on some of the durable goods more recently. But again, I think there's enough weakness there to say that the problems are more widespread and broad-based.
Okay, thank you. Another question, are there any federal government programs in place to hopefully combat the labor shortage?
So, I mean, certainly I think the Ivanka Trump is very active on this front. Jay Timmons, our president and CEO, is part of a task force that they work on this issue all the time. And so I think that is a huge priority. It's been an issue for manufacturers for a number of years. And you can see there on my title that I am also part of the Manufacturing Institute. The Manufacturing Institute really has made this their issue over the last decade or so, really focusing on how we can increase the number of workers going into manufacturing. Obviously, Heroes Make America is a program that we have to try to retrain and reskill military veterans as they're leaving the service on a number of bases around the country. We have a STEP initiative to really encourage more women to go into manufacturing. And there are also pretty aggressive plans to try to encourage more youth to go into manufacturing. And of course, the highlight of all of that is a Creators Wanted campaign for 2020, which really is going to focus on not just the NAM's 125th anniversary, but also trying to increase the overall perception about manufacturing and increase everyone's willingness to pursue that as a career. So yes, there are some government programs, but I think the bigger initiatives are really coming more from the private sector.
Thank you. What are the complexities that U.S. manufacturers will face if a full Brexit occurs?
Well, as you saw earlier, the UK is our 5th largest trading partner. Germany is our 6th largest trading partner. So they're huge markets for us as manufacturers. Outside of North America, Europe overall is our 2nd largest trading bloc. And so we need a strong Europe. We need a strong alliance with the UK, et cetera. I think there's a lot of uncertainty out there. I'm actually not surprised that there's an election. I think anyone who's followed the Brexit issue over the last few frustrating months or a couple of years saw the stalemate in Parliament and recognized that something had to break that stalemate. And so I'm not shocked that an election might help solve it. If there was a hard Brexit, obviously that would have had huge ramifications, especially for the UK's economy, perhaps sending it into a recession. Hopefully there is not a hard Brexit, and there is, there is a deal. Hopefully the election will solve that once and for all. But either way, the Britain has obviously been growing a lot slower than it had prior to that, and you've also seen weakness throughout Europe. So I think that there's on both sides of that conversation, there's a desire to have stronger growth and to try to move on.
Okay, and this is the final question. I'm surprised manufacturing construction has been low given the Opportunity Zone program and incentives that were in the Tax Act. Do you hear of any reasons?
I think the bigger part of that is just the uncertainties that are out there in the marketplace right now. I'm also surprised, as I noted to you earlier, we were seeing, right after tax reform passed, we were seeing really strong growth in the first half of 2018 on non-residential fixed investment. So that, to me, was a sign that tax reform was working, right? That you were getting a huge increase in both structures and equipment investment. But I think really from the second half of last year on, that's all been kind of counterbalanced by the trade conversation and slowing global growth, et cetera. And so I think that's really what's held back not just construction, but overall investment. And you see that in the GDP data. So I think that's really what's been the bigger challenge out there, is that slowing global growth.
All right, thank you. I'm going to pass it off to Jim.
Yeah, and thanks, Rachel. We just saw a question come up, I guess, a little late in the game. But Chad, any geographic growth areas in the economy within the manufacturing sector, specific regions of the country that seem to be holding their own?
I mean, I think we continue to see a lot of growth. I mean, I know people complain. I'm actually from Illinois, so I make this comment. People talk about the Rust Belt or the more traditional parts of the Midwest. We have seen actually quite a bit of growth in the Midwest more recently. Obviously, this most recent year has been more challenging, but Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana have done continue to do well. And you also have seen a lot of growth in obviously Texas and the Southeast, as well as I know people might wonder why, but California has actually continued to do quite well in terms of manufacturing employment more recently. Again, a lot of growth out there, especially in the tech sector and other sectors. So there are geographies which are pretty diverse there, both in terms of what some might consider to be pro-business regions like the Southeast or Indiana, et cetera, and even those areas like California, which are not known for being pro-business, but obviously have some pretty strong clusters of activity that are going to continue to attract manufacturing investment.
Okay, if anybody has any questions in mind, we'll give you just a few moments to document them in the chat list or the chat box there, and we'll wrap it up after you have that opportunity. Chad, it'll be like Final Jeopardy, okay? You can hear the music in the background.
I'm waiting for your music, the Jeopardy music.
I think that would cause an instantaneous hang up on this webinar, so.
Okay, we got a question. Percentage of a recession in 2020 baseline is not a recession.
So I think I mentioned it earlier, but perhaps I didn't say it enough. I think that the probability of a recession in 2020 is around 30%. I would have said 40 or so a couple months ago, certainly in that August time frame. So I do think we've seen a little bit of improvement in the risk of a recession since August. I mean, as you move into 2021, I mean, you might up that risk to 40% or so, but I think in 2020 itself, it's roughly 30%.
Okay, last call for questions, and I'll wrap up. I once again like to thank everybody for taking time out of their day to join us on this webinar. This has been very informative. I'd like to thank Chad and all his NAM colleagues for all you do to make sure that the manufacturer's voice is heard, not only in the nation, but across various state houses, as well as town halls. Your effort, certainly in making sure the voice is heard, is greatly appreciated. So once again, Chad did not do himself justice, but the information that he generates in his periodic dissemination of information on what's going on in the economy, specifically with the manufacturing sector, really is outstanding. And the way that NAM, Chad in particular, keeps us informed is certainly appreciated by folks within our firm and folks within the industry. So without hearing no other questions or seeing no other questions, I'd like to once again thank everybody and keep that in mind to fill the sleds of manufacturing type equipment, products, gold, railroad parts. The list is quite long, so we'll get our way out of it as we always do. And thanks for all you do, for you folks that are manufacturers that are listening in. Thanks so much for all you do in your innovation and making it happen. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day. And special shout out to anybody who's a veteran joining us on today's webinar. Thank you for the service to the nation. Thanks so much. Good afternoon.